The people here are a set of sly, artful, hypocritical rascals, cruel and cowards. Quick and violent in their determinations, they are quite fearful in the execution of them, unless, of course, they are quite certain of meeting little opposition, and then, like all cowards, they are cruel and tyrannical. But then Colonel Percy was given a responsibility to march his 5th Regiment out one night in April of '75 by way of Lexington to Concord, little town, because the spies had figured out that the colonists had hidden away a cache of arms in Concord, and his job was to go out in the night and then the next day march into Concord and confiscate those weapons and take them back and steal them from the colonists. So he marched out, and at dawn the next morning arrived in Lexington and found that there were about 100 of these colonists standing there in the village green, all dressed in farm clothes, each one different, muskets held every which way, but standing there defying the whole British 5th Regiment like a little string of banty roosters. And he was angry. And he marched out and he waved his sword. He said, "Lay down your arms, damn you! Lay down your arms!" And then someone shouted fire, and some muskets went off, and before the smoke cleared, there was more shooting, and when they could see again, 8 or 10 of the farmers lay on the ground. The rest had all run off. None of the British were even wounded. So they shouted, and they fired their muskets a little bit, and they marched on. There was no good reason for shouting. All through that night march, they had heard church bells and gunshots in the dark, and somehow some of the colonists had learned the British were marching to Concord, and they had roused that whole countryside against them. As they approached Concord, more and more the colonists were in front of them on the hills. They kept falling back, but as they got into town, the colonists began to fire at them. From behind every tree and wall and window along the way, they were firing at them. Now, these are red-coated guys with big white cross belts on their perfect targets, and they were taking some hits. And the colonists were not making themselves available to get return fire, so they started, the redcoats started backing up. In fact, they backed up all the way back to Boston. It was a rout. That was an extraordinary presentation for Hugh Earl Percy. He wrote to his colleagues back in London after that and said, "Whoever looks upon them as an irregular mob will find himself much mistaken. They have men amongst them who know very well what they are about, nor are several of them void of the spirit of enthusiasm, as we discovered, for a number marched to within 10 yards to fire at me and other officers. For my part, I confess I never believed they would attack the king's troops, or have had the perseverance we found in them yesterday." Totally changed his mind. But the British were locked up in Boston, stuck, because that night and in the nights that followed, campfires sprang up all the way encircling the town of Boston, as those New England farmers gathered by the thousands to keep the British from marching again. But they were farmers. There was spring. They had work to do. Yeah, we had them boxed in proper, but they couldn't get out. We couldn't get in, and us farmers had a lot more to do than sitting around waiting for Lord Howe to make a move against us. So one night in June, we set about a small operation, see what we could stir up. Result of what we done is known as the Battle of Bunker's Hill. Now, Boston. See, Boston was right out over there. I was almost surrounded by water. Across the bay up here to the north was a little piece of ground came close to it called the Charlestown Peninsula. Well, 3 things you ought to know about that. It was connected to the shore by a little narrow strip of ground called the Charlestown Neck. Then there was a hill right close up to that neck called Bunker's Hill. But then you see, there was another hill up closer in toward Boston called Breed's Hill. Well, I was in Colonel William Prescott's regiment. We paraded at 10 p.m. on the 16th of June, one day's provisions, marched down to Charlestown Heights, and there in the night we built a fort on Breed's Hill. Some thought it were bunkers. It weren't. Now at dawn, when the British saw that fort, where at dusk no fort had been, I think it upset them. You see, we was perfectly situated to fire cannon shot into the entire British fleet sitting out there in the harbor, and into Lord Howe's headquarters right up there in Boston. Of course, we didn't have no cannon. But the British didn't know that. A little 10-gun sloop started firing at us first, and then about 45 minutes later, the whole fleet joined up. But see, the fort was high up on the hill. Most of them couldn't even elevate their guns enough to hit us. Even so, some of our boys started leaving. We let them go. Then that battery up there on Copp's Hill in Boston began firing at us. Now that was a good deal higher, you see. And one of their cannonballs burst our only cask of water. One of our boys went down the hill to get some more, and another ball took his head off. Well, Colonel Prescott, he just leaped right up there onto the highest part of the fort, right at that parapet wall, and he just strolled back and forth just to show us there was nothing to fear. You know, there are those who revere Bunker's Hill, and no battle was ever fought there. Others, better informed, they praise Breed's, and there's some reason for that. But if you would choose a piece of ground where history was made that day, choose the neck. Charlestown Neck. It was 30 yards wide, 100 yards long, water on each side, at one end safety, at the other end battle, and over it all, a boom and smoke and terror and iron death. About 10:30, two of the British gunboats and the armed transporters of Symmetry dropped anchor just off that neck, and they began to wreck that stretch of ground with every gun they could bring to bear. Ring shot and grape and chain and ball swept all the bushes, most of the grass away, tore into the earth and whistled in the air like demons. Now, the men in the fort, we shouted for water and rum and food, while wagons full of those things piled up safely on the road to the north of the neck. Who would cross that neck to help us? Hundreds now stood on the north side watching that little narrow strip of ground. Smoke billowed round it, fire burst on it. Who would cross that neck to help us? A boy. He might have been 15. Came from somewhere, and he took in the scene. "Where's the fight?" he asked. Well, the watchers pointed dumbly across the way as if to say, "It's out of reach, boy. It's among the stars." "Thank you," said the boy politely. And for a moment they could see him running along that neck. But the British in the gunboats saw him too, and the cannon's roar doubled and redoubled, and smoke blotted over that small figure, and he was gone. "We should have tried to stop him," said one of the watchers. Nobody answered him. "I say, we shouldn't have let him go." Another one swung him around with a look of fury. "Shut up," he said. And when he turned back, he was the first one to see that boy, still running, emerge from the smoke and scamper up the side of Bunker's Hill. They came, though screaming death passed above them. They came, though the ground burst out from beneath them, though the man before them was torn to rags, though the men behind pleaded they stay. They came. They came alone when their friends would not go on. A company stopped, but one squad kept on. By the tens they came. A battalion faltered, but one company marched on, and others joined in. By the hundreds they came. Charlestown Neck was a purifying fire, a machine of selection, a filter of souls. And those who crossed that funnel of hell, who filled the breastwork and manned the rail fence and extended our line down to the beach of the Mystic River, those were not men. Charlestown Neck was too narrow for men. Only giants could pass. About 1 o'clock, the British longboats filled with men rounded the point at Copp's Hill and passed in front of the fort. And then Lord Howe landed his men unopposed on a stretch of the Mystic River breach that was hidden from the fort by a low hill. But see, the American lines had begun to fill. Now Howe was faced with an enemy more than 1,000 strong, where just a few hundred had been. But he thought of the slow rate of fire of muskets. He was sure his regulars would break through. These Americans weren't regimented. They couldn't possibly compare in firing proficiency with regular troops. He didn't know what the Charlestown Neck had done that day. Against any normal group of men, his smooth, glittering, invincible forces would take their losses and move forward till somewhere on that enemy line one man would jump and he'd run. And then several would see him and catch the fever, and then all would go. And that's the way a field is taken against any normal group of men. And yet all along that line, those British redcoats marched forward to their death. The vast distance of 50 yards, we fired, and they fell in incredible numbers, and they wavered and reformed and came on, and again our terrible musketry, and again the carnage. Out of every 10 men in that first British wave, 8 fell, and no American had yet been wounded. Lord Howe called a council of war. The fort was the high point on the battle line. You take the fort and all must melt away. The fort was the field. It was the apex, the hub, the eye of the storm. Inside the fort, the walls had held and concentrated the sunlight till the air was too thick to breathe. We were out of water. Our only food was salt pork. We were almost out of powder. We had some artillery cartridges. Cut those open and passed them around. Lick them once more, they'll never come back. Well, at first, it seemed they were coming just as before. Then the British right wing swung away from that rail fence, and they began to advance towards us in the fort. Now, with those who'd come from the breastwork, our fort now held 400. But it was being attacked on 3 sides by 1,500 British regular troops. Muskets leveled, drums beaten across the bodies of their own dead. They came towards that quiet fort when no man, no gun showed over the wall. 50 yards, 40, still no sign from the fort. 35 yards, still nothing. 30. Then we appeared, hundreds of us, our muskets cocked, aimed, and as one we fired, tearing great holes in the British line, but the gaps closed, and the regulars came on, and again our volley thundered from the parapet, and again those deadly gaps, and again they filled. First of the British were now in the ditch outside the wall. This was victory, they thought. Best regular troops don't defend a fort with the enemy in the ditch outside. They tried to scale the wall, they'd throw a leg over, we'd smash them back with our muskets used as clubs. One of our men jumped up on the wall and began firing down into the ditch below. He shot only officers. He never missed. So we passed loaded muskets up to him fast as he could discharge them. We counted his score. Count reached 15. We were cheering for every shot. 16, 17, 18, we cried. Red-coated men poured in from the rear, but still the defenders wouldn't go. We grappled, we hit, we cursed, and bit, and fell, and bled, and rose from the dead to hit once more before we died. 19, 20, the loaders cried. But then a redcoat officer came and fired a pistol at point-blank range. The young sharpshooter threw his left hand in the air and fell from the wall with blood in his hair, and falling, drove the muzzle of his gun into that officer's chest. 21. We were out of powder. There was more British in the fort than Americans. So, swinging our empty muskets, the few of us still on our feet slowly backed out of the fort. Moment came when there was no more enemy behind us. We turned and we fled. You know, most anybody you talk to will tell you the Americans lost the Battle of Bunker's Hill. Yeah, well, we did. But that day was a victory for me. I've always thought of freedom as being a fine thing and all, but standing there on that hill with 1,000 men coming at me to kill me, I suddenly realized I'm free because I choose to be free. And nothing, not even death, can shake me from it. You know, I think any man or woman doesn't feel that way about freedom, doesn't have it. Yeah? you.